We are live. Good to see you today, my EOS Podcast friends. This is the EOS Podcast by EOS Writer. Big shout out to the sound engineer. This smooth, silky sound you hear coming through your ears now is because we have Scott at Hybrid Games. He's a sound engineer, and he's also an EOS developer developing Hybrid.games, which is a cool sensory input game that's being built on the EOS blockchain. If anyone is using SenseChat or not using Sense.chat yet, I have free wallets to give out. So hit me up in the EOS Podcast Telegram channel and I will get you a free SenseChat wallet. And shout out to EOS Studio and Rose Wren. They have an easy to use environment for dApp development, and EOS Studio is doing big things. So if you know anyone developing dApps on EOS, send them towards EOS Studio. They just had another release. Without further ado, today, my EOS Podcast friends, we have Maurice, the producer of Jekyll Island, The Truth Behind the Federal Reserve. This is such a cool podcast today. I just started going deeper down the rabbit hole because of this movie. It's about the greatest ripoff in history, the way money and debt are controlled. So we are going to go down the rabbit hole even further with Maurice. So Maurice, welcome to the show. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, my name is Maurice, UCLA graduate in engineering. Been a small business owner since 1991. I own multiple businesses. Through those experiences, you end up sooner or later questioning where your interest expense goes to. And, we had a lot of issues during the 2008 financial crisis, which led to a lot more questions. Then, of course, a few years later, we had the Occupy Wall Street movement, which led to even more questions. I was a big supporter of the Occupy LA movement, provided solar panels, solar batteries, donations, and it's there where I came across a very interesting documentary, The Money Masters. And after watching that documentary, I started to put two and two together. And a few years later, 2012, 2013, produced my documentary. Now, what's interesting is right about the same time, about a year later, we started a programming academy. We started with the basics, HTML, CSS, and we moved on to JavaScript, PHP, frameworks. We just finished C++. And about 2 years prior to that, I would say about 2017, is when they both intersected. What do I mean by that? This knowledge about monetary policy and this knowledge about programming. And I started mining for Bitcoin and Ethereum. Built quite a bit of a mining operation. But once you get into Bitcoin and you get into Ethereum, you start being exposed to more data. And what was interesting is that I went to a blockchain conference in Santa Monica, and the opening speaker was Brock Pierce. And if you've ever had the opportunity to meet him, he's positive energy, creates a very compelling picture of what the future should look like. And I didn't know yet that he was involved with EOS. So as the programming classes continue, you started hearing this buzzword, dApps. And it's then where I had a Google alert for dApps. And back then, it used to be you would get an alert every 3 days. And now, of course, it's every day. And it's 8 to 9 to 10 articles. So through that Google alert, the buzzword dApp, I've discovered EOS. And big supporter ever since, right? I got shirts,
nice,
white and black. I've been playing basketball as a hobby for the last 20 years, and our new basketball team name is going to be named EOS.
Nice.
I'm a big supporter of the movement.
Nice.
So yeah, why don't we? I have some video clips prepared. Why don't we give your followers a taste of what the movie's like? And kind of a window into what we're been shackled with since birth.
Yeah.
Without further ado, let me share that.
Cool. Yeah, give them a taste. This will be. I got really interested in this documentary right when I started watching it. I can tell I was going to like it. A lot of facts, a lot of pictures, a lot of.
All right, you
intrigue.
guys ready? 3, 2, 1.
But fractional reserve lending not only made the goldsmiths rich, it gave them control over the quantity of money in the entire economy. What good was that? By acting in concert with other goldsmiths, if they refused to lend out their gold receipts and call in their old loans, it caused a depression. The second thing the goldsmiths learned was that if they could get the king to borrow from them, then soon the king would become dependent on these loans being renewed time and time again. Once the king was dependent on new loans, the goldsmiths could make sure that no new laws would ever be passed which would harm their counterfeiting business, the most lucrative business in the history of humanity.
Yeah, that talking about the control of the lending for the money supply and the fractional reserve is kind of one of the most interesting things that I was looking into, or that I was intrigued by during this.
Yeah, and just as a disclaimer, I'm not trying to sell any more movies. It's on YouTube for free. We'll make sure there's a link. This is a funny story, but now that I'm going to meetups and I'm going to events that involve cryptocurrencies and blockchains, this is a topic that I bring up because I firmly believe this was the catalyst for Bitcoin. In fact, if you start looking at some documentaries about the early documentaries about Bitcoin, you hear about the cypherpunks, and they were thinking back in the 90s about a digital currency. And I think that a lot of people in our field that are promoting EOS, Bitcoin, Ethereum, whatever, Tron, Cardano, whatever it is that they're promoting, they do not have the foundation of just how criminal our liquidity is being created into existence. And so, we'll talk some more. I got some more videos. We even got the ex-prime minister of Canada to chime in and tell us, why are we borrowing money? I will add this, which was interesting, and it's not part of the clips. When I was doing the research for the movie, and you can look this up in the Treasury website, this is 2011, 2012, and the United States paid $452 billion in interest that year. Interest expense. And what's interesting is that year, the California budget was only $94 billion. So we all hear about California. Any day of the week, it could be between the 4th biggest and 7th biggest economy in the world. And 94 billion compared to 455 billion. So that tells us that if we eliminated paying interest expense, our federal governments could literally fine probably every state and its expenses. So anyway, it's just a little tidbit out there.
Yeah. Can you dig into a little bit the, how money is created by borrowing and not printing? Because I think that's at the core of what that quote was about.
I got a video for that.
Right. Okay. That's good. A good segue. That was kind of one of the things I was wrapping my head around, though. As you get this up, I'll kind of
so there's a couple, right?
Mm-hmm.
I got a couple of videos, so it's going to be great. So one of them, of course, is fractional reserve lending, right? The banks do not have the money that they lend you. So when we buy a house and it's $550,000, let's say we put a $50,000 payment, the bank only has to have 10% of this actual money. So 50,000. The other 450,000 comes from the borrowers, the depositors. But once you sign on that dotted line, now you owe the bank $450,000, but the depositors are also entitled to their money. So we just created $450,000 into existence by signing a loan document. And one is national borrowing. What people don't understand is that the country shouldn't have to borrow. When you have these 3 months, 6 months T-bills that happen every month, it could be 5 to 10 years, yada yada. Private money can buy the bonds, but whatever isn't purchased, the Federal Reserve buys by default. But they don't have the money. They're just creating accounting entries, and all of a sudden, the people owe this money. So anyway, without further ado, let's get some of my friends from the movie to share this with us.
Our money supply has to be borrowed into existence by the community of money users, that's us, from the commercial banks.
The bulk of money creation is made by banks.
The banks decide when and how much money they are going to produce, so to say. The money supply is out of control, out of any control.
When governments today, they borrow money from the banks, basically you are just enslaving the rest of the economy, the people.
You need to create the money for the good of the people. It has to be a common good.
The banks have usurped that prerogative of creating money.
The problem is that we've given the power to create money to the banking sector, and we've let them use that power more or less unrestrained.
The new money coming into the economy starts as debt created by the banks, and it's unsustainable.
So we got a lot of people to chime in and explain exactly how money is created. And it took me a while to get my head around it too, because you're talking about liquidity, talking about debt, you're talking about this monetary supply, and it's just a complex idea to wrap your head around. And now it rolls off my tongue. But back in 2012, 2013, it was still a little difficult to understand that our liquidity is created into existence through debt. So anyway, I got another clip, and we could talk a little more, and I'll share some more information. I also got some quotes, and in fact, you said that you can. Let's make this interactive a little bit. From the movie, we created a silver dollar logo.
Oh, killer!
To give this away, I have some questions, but why don't this be the first question for one of these? And it comes in a nice case.
Ooh.
How many central banks has the United States had into existence, including the current one? So that'll be our first question.
How many central banks has the U.S. had in existence?
History.
In its history. Okay, and if people want to answer these questions, come into the EOS Podcast Telegram channel. That's the easiest way to keep track of competitions and questions. And write the question, how many central banks has the U.S. had in its history? Write your answer, and then I will DM back and forth with you and Maurice, and we'll get your prize, a silver, that really cool silver coin out to you. Cool. Nice. Thank you. That's rad. I mean, people are going to be excited when they're listening to this podcast. Whoever some of the first people listening to this podcast are going to be really excited to hear this. So, on the you can kind of play the next video now. But what's intriguing about this idea of the fractional reserve is that fractional reserve can be cash. It can also be a hard money gold supply. So, you find out things like when Andrew Jackson took us the U.S. to completely debt-free and put us on the gold standard, actually putting us onto the gold, putting gold as a hard money within the United States didn't solve the problem, because bankers were still able to control the gold, have a fractional reserve, lend out more gold than they had, create debt. So it's not about gold or fiat. It's actually the act of the money being able to be controlled by central banks, and then the fractional reserve put on top of that. So the hypothesis there is it's not fiat or gold or hard money. It is debt-free money. So, the goal here is a government-controlled, or maybe decentralized now, money that's debt-free is what really gets to the heart of the problem, So, yeah.
All right. Well,
let's see that next video.
Play another, but that you hit it on the money. And actually, Andrew Jackson, I got some quotes for our audience, and they're mostly Andrew Jackson. So we'll get to those in a second. But yes, our monetary supply cannot be backed by a mineral that can also be gamed. And, that happened in the 70s with silver, and, it's happened time and time again with gold. So without further ado, let me play another video.
Actually loaning real money. It is simply adding some numbers to an account. In exchange, the borrower agrees to repay this loan with compounding interest. But where does the interest money come from? Well, you either have to take it from someone else, reducing their ability to service their interest-bearing loans, or you have to take out another loan to repay your existing loan. In other words, this system creates a global Ponzi scheme based on ever-increasing levels of debt.
Anyway, I hope our audience got the gist of it. That's exactly right. What ends up happening is, to be able to service the interest expense of the original loan, you have to now get more loans out to be able to service that interest. So it's unsustainable. And, we came close to that system to break down in 2008, and they wiggled out of it. I wasn't going to talk about this, but I'll have to throw this little tidbit. And since we are interested in rabbit holes, the Federal Reserve Act was written into law in 1913, but the origination was Jekyll Island, which is a barrier island off the coast of Georgia. And I have some pictures here to show our audience once we get there. But there was an equally nefarious act of legislation called the Monetary Act of 1980. So we're just going to leave that there for people that are interested in doing research. But it was because of the Monetary Act of 1980 that the banks were able to save themselves from that financial crisis. And, I thought there would be a lot more anger in the streets when people would finally realize that the bailout money was borrowed into existence to bail out the banks, and yet they're the ones that own the Federal Reserve. So here's an interesting question. Many people say that the Federal Reserve is private. Well, if it is private, then who owns the Federal Reserve?
Isn't that kind of a mystery?
Well, from my readings, it's nationally chartered banks own the Federal Reserve. And they are, legislation does say that they're supposed to share 8% of their earnings back to the United States, the people of the United States. And they have there are some entries that I've seen where 8% of what they make gets put back in, but it's minimal. In fact, most people think China is our biggest lender. It's not true. You can just Google it now. It's the Federal Reserve that is our biggest lender.
So what would be, do you have an example of a nationally chartered bank or what that is?
Yeah,
That's
Bank of America, Chase, Citigroup, Wells Fargo.
Oh, so the actual banks are the Federal Reserve, you're saying?
Yes, they own it, and the money masters own it, this interest expense through their Class A shares, which the regular people don't even have privy to know who owns them. And then, of course, they use, groups, LLCs, to own the Class A shares. So, very little goes back to the Rothschilds, to the Warburgs, to the Chefs, to the Vanderbilts, to the Carnegies, these families that still control a lot of the wealth in the world.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So it brings us back to, EOS and blockchain and this UBI and how voice can change things. And, at some point we do need to talk about EOS because that is kind of my next favorite subject.
Yeah. Well, how do you think that ties in? How do you see the transition, or if there is a transition, from this fractional reserve type system into something that's more, that's true money, or that's not inflating, or that you're not creating debt? Inflation is not the right word. That someone's not able to control the supply and create debt to basically tax the people holding it. How do you see the transition to cryptocurrency going?
So I like to answer that question with an example, right? So isn't it interesting that there was someone working in the 50s building a freeway, we'll say the 405, and they were working on a lane, and let's say the number 4 lane, the fast lane. And if you are from Southern California, whatever work this person did in the 50s is incredibly valuable now. I don't think we could put a price tag on lane 4 of the 405 freeway. But yet, the labor that he did back in the 50s is now worthless, while it should be more valuable. So now we have, Social Security people. We're building our productivity on that person building that lane that gets us to places quicker and faster, or products or services quicker and faster. So because of the system that we're in, we are creating inflation, which is eroding the value created by that person. But now and it's man-made. This inflation is man-made. Well, if it's man-made, then we can produce the opposite effect. And what does that mean? That means, and this is what one of the things that really resonates with me about EOS, it's that we are able to create value, and over time, that asset could be worth more as opposed to less. And when it's worth more, it can't be gained out of your hands. Let's just use like our grandmothers as an example. They're getting Social Security checks that are worthless now. They can't do anything with it. So it's easier to take that $800 check away from them. Milk is more expensive, fuel is more expensive, rent's more expensive. But imagine if it had the opposite effect. It'd be a lot harder to gain that value out of that person's hands. So I see everything positive. Voice, right, has the opportunity to create a passive income to ordinary folk. It's just ironic that the laws that have been written into existence to pay the national debt are getting in the way of doing that, something that shouldn't even be complicated. I mean, voice should launch. Everybody should have
Yeah. So could you dig just a little bit deeper into what you're explaining there? As something becomes more valuable, it's harder to take away. You use the example of Social Security check for $800. You can't buy anything with it now, but you're saying if you could buy things with it because it's more valuable, it'd be harder to take it away from people. Is that what the point was there?
Yeah, it would be harder to gain away from people. We've created an inflationary system because we're creating our liquidity through borrowing. And to service that debt interest, you have to create more loans. And the purchasing power of a monetary unit then devalues over time. And it's easier to take away value from others when the monetary unit also loses its strength. So as we was referring to a grandmother with $800 it's easy to take that away from her through rental increases and so on and so forth. But if you have a monetary unit that over time is increasing in value, then the chances are that it's harder to gain that money away from this individual. Mm-hmm. And this is what excites me about EOS and voice. And voice is just the lead-in, right? We use Google search all the time. They sell our metadata, but they don't share some of their revenue with EOS. And this ability that we can sign in with an identity, then it's very easy for the provider of the service to share some of the revenue. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So anyway.
Yeah, so it's that hidden tax, the inflation is just basically a tax on that we don't have to vote for. And that's something that is a real nefarious part of inflation and printing money and debt. I like the idea of EOS being somewhat deflationary as long as we can continue to grow the network. What do you think about the tie-ins with EOS and the U.S. government? Do you think that that's a good thing or a bad thing overall?
Well, I am an optimist, eternal optimist, and the government really is there to assist people, and we need it. We can't just, big projects, landing on the moon, Hubble telescope, a lot of the Federal Highway Act of the 1950s. These are big ideas that wouldn't have started without the help of the government. So, we may have to be patient, but we need that tie-in of government and new emerging technologies. The reality is that, the majority of the politicians or the people in government know very little about how our liquidity is created into existence. Do I believe they're good people? I believe they're good people. And so whatever we can do to educate our governmental officials and politicians about a better way, it needs to be done. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I tend to agree there. I think that it's easy to start just saying that the whole government is the problem, or is this giant conspiracy for power and to keep the people down. But there is a lot of good that the government pushes out. And at the 80-20 rule, the big portion of our problem is really just how the money supply is manipulated, and that is where most of our woes come from. So it'll be interesting to see all the different angles that cryptocurrency starts chipping away at it. One of the things I like to think about is just the option to kind of opt out of the US dollar as it stands. People now have, it's not a flood of people, but they now have the option to trade their US dollar in and pick something that they believe is more sound or better for them. For example, you can take some of your money and put it into EOS, as a hedge against the inflation of the dollar. So that's kind of a nice slow leak that I like to think of when it comes to how that transition will happen.
I think anything that takes us away from this permanent debt creation is a good idea. Mm-hmm. And speaking of great politicians and good people that are politicians, I have a clip from an ex-Prime Minister of Canada. And you tell me if this is a bad person. It's just that, sometimes even the people in charge can only do so much. I'm going to play a clip with the ex-Prime Minister of Canada. Here we go.
The Treasury, lacking confidence in the country, delivered itself bound hand and foot to bold and bankrupt bankers pretending to have money, whom it could have crushed at any moment.
If they'd done what Jefferson and wanted them to do, and others have suggested that they do, they wouldn't have any government debt. They could be debt-free. And that's the way it should have been. But they were taken to the cleaners by a small clique of international bankers, and it was international even then, who were smarter than they were, and who had done their homework, and the American people have been paying for it ever since.
Whenever the banking sector, particularly the large banks, have gained control of the money supply, then we always have had crises. We always have had inflation, asset inflation, a financial crisis, banking crisis, systemic crisis, and that's the truth.
Anyway, the ex-Prime Minister of Canada had it right on. We do need to change the system, and blockchain offers this hopeful tool that we can change things. So, going to current news, right? We were talking about Libra, and it's a cryptocurrency that is backed by fiat money. So that in itself tells me that they do not understand why we're into crypto, digital currencies, and blockchain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, can you explain what basket of assets or what the fiat money is that backs Libra, or what that looks like? And I think though they may have released most of the details today on Libra coin. Is that right?
That's correct. And I will quote from an article that I read this morning. The cryptocurrency will be backed by the Libra Reserve, a collection of low volatility assets like bank deposits and government securities in currencies from stable and reputable central banks. A Libra associated spokesperson tells Yahoo Finance. So it's clear that Facebook does not understand the underlying problem. And that's why we need to keep supporting EOS. And I did want to bring this up. We hear the negative. It's decentralized. It's not decentralized. Too much in the East, not enough in the West. And to me, we are getting out of a pool that is 45 degrees Fahrenheit. And now we're in a pool that's 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet people are now complaining that it's not warm enough. Mm-hmm. I mean, this thing about decentralization, not centralized enough, has to stop. We really need to just focus on promoting the emergence of this technology, starting by what even Dan Dillermer says. I mean, if we all agreed that we would embrace voice and accept our payments, and all of us did it at the same time, how is that going to be illegal? They're going to cart us all off to the jails?
Yeah. I mean, that's a point that I talk about often, is this idea that we have this fiat money, this these debt created instruments that are kind of manipulating us on one end. And so people want to swing all the way to, it has to be Bitcoin. It has to be an immutable ledger, store of value. It can't be, it can't be anything besides that. But there's a gray area, like you said, like the water temperature. There's a place in between somewhere where this works, and it and it's scalable, and we can make huge sweeping changes that'll have big impacts. And so that's why I'm a fan of EOS. I think that who cares East and West? Who cares about some of these other topics? Like there's somewhere in the middle that works, and voice is a great example. This possibility of mass adoption is what matters. So and so you said something. Go ahead.
I wanted to share a quote from Andrew Jackson. He staked his 1832 re-election on killing the second Bank of the United States. And I wanted to share veto message.
The Andrew Jackson veto message. Okay.
Yeah.
So it appears, do you want me to read it?
Yeah, why don't you read it? Go ahead.
It appears that more than a fourth part of the stock is held by foreigners, and the residue is held by a few hundred of our own citizens, chiefly of the richest class. Is there no danger to our liberty and independence in a bank that in its nature has so little to bind it to our country? Controlling our currency, receiving our public monies, and holding thousands of our citizens' independence.
And he follows with this. Go ahead.
Would be more formidable and dangerous than a naval and military power of the enemy. If government would confine itself to equal protection and, as heaven does it rains, shower its favor alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. In the act before me, there seems to be a wide and unnecessary departure from these just principles. Andrew Jackson, 1832 veto message. So he was vetoing the banks trying to become a central bank again.
So correct. So he was vetoing the 20-year charter for the second bank of the United States. The first one, and we're giving away our answer. So if you're paying attention, you're going to get that
nice
question. The first one only lasted 10 years. It didn't even last to this 20 years because it was so corrupt. Those that control the creation of the money control the politicians and control the laws. So now let's fast forward. This is really interesting. But the Federal Reserve Act started with the 20-year charter. And then it went to a 50-year charter. And now it's in perpetuity. There's not even a law that says when their charter will come up again.
Wow. And that first Federal Reserve Bank, I think, was famously called the Den of Vipers by Andrew Jackson as he crushed it, or maybe that was the second central bank. But yeah, an interesting point there is that as we talked about before, there's this centralized money or centralized central bank that creates debt. And when they create debt, that's the problem. But then you can also have decentralized bank, which they had when Andrew Jackson shut everything down and put everyone on the hard gold standard. But decentralized, wealthy people can still control all of the gold and then lend out and have a fractional reserve. So decentralized it still can have a fractional reserve if the money supply is controlled. So what was suggested was a centralized government issued money, but with no fractional reserve. Is that the right take on that as far as like the decentralized versus centralized aspect?
So here was the problem with Andrew Jackson, and we have a great opportunity to not repeat it. So the issue is he did kill the second bank of the United States. He did pay off all the national debt, but unfortunately, that's as far as he went. He let the states create their own currencies And that's where the problem was. You know, back in the 1850s, if you put your gold in the Bank of Texas, and then for whatever reason, a year and a half later, you ended up in California, well, the Bank of California didn't have the ability to know just what certificate or deposit they had. They didn't have a real-time way to value how the Bank of Texas was valuing, you know, the ounce of gold. You know, there was this lack of immediate information. And he left this to the States to create the currency. And, you know, that was gained into disaster. I don't want to get into more American history, but I will say that the liquidity was intentionally dried up. And so it made it very uncomfortable for commerce, which then elicits, you know, other emotions. So anyway, that is on that. So in regards to how liquidity should be created, I mean, we're getting to the point where if we're all valuable, right? And if we extrapolate where we're going, we all have the ability to pay and receive through a token that at some point will have some value. And this is what excites me about EOS. So I want to take this opportunity, you know, we're to discuss some of the new projects and some that I haven't seen advertised too much. And on this particular one, I want to talk about EOS Venezuela and following Dan Larimer's idea of universal basic income. And they've taken a number of families and created EOS accounts for, and through donations, which by the way, they're lacking. So we want to go to EOS Venezuela's. They have projects, they have families and students. And what they do is if we donate to one basic income, that's their EOS account name, then they will distribute their crypto digital currency to specific families. And what makes EOS awesome is that a person like me that's donating can audit the account and know where the money is going. Which brings me to a really interesting point, because I wrote a script. I analyzed all the families that they were sending EOS to, or and theirs is the crypto peso. And I wrote a script and I distributed directly to all these families one EOS. And so it gives us the ability to give value to the people that need it. And so I know that whoever sees this, you gotta Google EOS Venezuela, you gotta look at this project, and you gotta support whatever you can support. What that country is going through is unimaginable. And I'll follow up with this. When the United States got into Afghanistan, the monthly income for a citizen in Kabul, Afghanistan, was $2 per month, $2 per month. When I started doing research on the EOS Venezuela, I found out that a Caracas citizen is making $7 per month. Well, what makes it really interesting is that a Kabul citizen in Afghanistan today is making $9. And if you've ever been to South America, Colombia, Venezuela, I'm Colombian, it's beautiful. I mean, there's water, there's sun, the weather, it never snows. I mean, it's
paradise, huh?
It's eternal spring. There's a song in Colombia where Medellin is said to be the city of eternal spring. So there's just no way that a citizen in Venezuela should only be worth $7. So anyway, EOS Venezuela, we want to plug them in. We don't want them to give up. You know, the interesting part about EOS is that now you see how their donations are coming in, and it's a little sad that they're not getting enough help. So anyway, there's my
I'll
plug.
have to bring them back on the show. I think I had EOS Venezuela I had on almost a year ago, so it's been way too long. I need to figure out follow up with them. So I'll make a note of that and get EOS Venezuela back on the show, because these are the places that are such good indicators and case studies for how powerful crypto is too. I mean, you're giving examples of EOS and these donations in that script affecting real people's lives. I mean, that gets to the heart. That's real things happening. This isn't just big thoughts and idea thought experiments. There's stuff going on. So that's fantastic. I got one of these. When you think of Venezuela, it reminds me of the $10 billion deal. I know they got the $1 trillion bank reserve in Zimbabwe as well. So, I keep this around to keep on the forefront of my mind the inevitable end to every fiat currency. That's another fun idea that people don't consider often, is that fiat currency is such a new experiment in the grand history of money. All the different iterations of money we've had, fiat currency is very recent. And what I mean by fiat is in the 70s, when we were taken off the gold standard, we started one of the greatest experiments of all time. And so money is always shifting with people. It's part of our almost human nature, how we trade and barter with each other. And fiat money, the system that we're currently using, is just one of the newest experiments. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's 40, 50 years old. And so we're stuck to it like, oh, this is the way we do it. Not really. This is a really short stint. So the transition over to crypto is a pretty natural progression, I think, right now. So,
I agree. And which brings me to another part of how money should be created into existence. Even if we maybe cannot catch up to blockchain as quickly as we want to. I mean, obviously, I think that is part of the solution. But as you pointed something out, there was only one time in American history where the government actually printed money into existence for the benefit of the citizens without interest. And that's when you have this red seal. And it's, if you look at the top, it's named as United States Note. In fact, I got an image to share.
Okay.
Let me find it real quick.
And was that a greenback you just showed there? Was that what that is?
So correct.
Okay,
This is known as the greenback, which is really interesting because when you hear some of the talking heads on the business channels, they refer to the Federal Reserve dollar as a greenback, and that is correct, which tells me that they don't understand about how our liquidity is created into existence.
Mm-hmm. And so what's the history of the greenback? Is Lincoln printed that for you? You want to give that history real quickly?
Sure, yeah. So I got a quote on that I could share.
You are on it.
Wanted Abraham Lincoln to come up with something different because, and I'm going to share this quote. It's going to take me a little bit to find it, but give me a second. And it says, tell your colleagues that you have seen a man who's at the head of the finances of Europe, and that he has told you that they cannot borrow a dollar, not a dollar. So what was happening is that Abraham Lincoln now had the Civil War in his hands, and he obviously needed to buy ammunition, everything that goes into a war. And the bankers wanted to charge as high as 30% northwards in interest. And so he said, we can't do that. We're going to print to existence our own money. And it says it has to be accepted to pay public and private debt. And he did two of them. It was the Legal Tender Act of 1862 and the Legal Tender Act of 1863. And it was 450 million that were printed into existence with no debt. And so what I would suggest is go on eBay, Brendan, and get yourself at least one of them. I got a nice collection of, before I knew EOS, now all my money goes into EOS. And before I knew EOS, I would buy $100 notes of United States notes. So in fact, I'll show one. I may have to stand from my desk or get one of my assistants to get my computer behind my desk.
Yeah, if you want to show one, I can pause this real quick. Why don't you grab it and we'll check it out?
Okay, pause it.
Okay. All right, so let's see that note there.
All right. So, this is, not investment advice, but if you have a heart and a little passion for history, you're going to want to get yourself one of these. It's a $100 United States note, and I buy the ones that are graded. Wow. And the basic difference is that it says United States note right on the top. Mm-hmm. The current money says Federal Reserve notes, which doesn't belong to us. What's interesting is that our national debt is our liquidity. And so, when politicians talk about limiting the national debt, they're not understanding monetary policy. So anyway, yet another rabbit hole. But what it excites me is EOS. EOS all the way. This ability to, a person like me, be able to write script and touch lives in Venezuela that I don't even know, but we know through email at some point they'll be able to communicate with me just because of my identity. And it creates a really interesting, I don't know, I'm excited about it, an interesting ideal that society can now have a personal connection between those that really need it and those that can give it. In fact, I've tasked my son for the upcoming year to adopt EOS Venezuela's idea and raise funds and share some of their winnings, however they raise money, and directly give to those that need it. So EOS is creating all this, and if it's decentralized or not, if it's from the East or the West, let me tell you, there was an article about EOS Venezuela family, and the one EOS they did receive made a difference between not having any meats for a day and meats for the next 3 or 4 days. And we're not talking prime Angus beef, we're talking just chicken. So they don't care. They don't care if it's centralized or not. All they know is that it's touching their lives in a positive manner. And this FUD about not decentralized or centralized has to end. So until at least we get rid of that 45-degree pool, that cold water that we live ourselves day in and day out.
Yeah, let's take that huge step. And voice is going to be the universal resource inheritance, or UBI, whatever you'd like to call it, with voice. It is going to have the ability to massively touch a lot of people. And hopefully that's something that spreads quickly in places like Venezuela where it really matters, where that whatever it is, few dollars a month possibly is big. That'll be great. That'll be great. And I love the idea of the charity that can be done on blockchain, when all of a sudden you can cut out the middleman as far as all these entities that take most of the charity before it actually gets to the people in need. I mean, that direct giving that you're doing is powerful. That's hugely powerful. It's great. What do you think of as far as maybe stable coins? Because we talked about Libra, and I think it's called the global coin, which what's Facebook's called, that they're kind of pinning it as a stable coin. The funny thing about that is it's tied to baskets of fiat, which are through debt inflating and so devaluing. So when you're using a stable coin like global coin, or almost all stable coins are tied to fiat. You have a stable coin, but it's devaluing over time. So there's a project called Liberty Dollar 2. Are you familiar with the Liberty Dollar projects or Liberty Dollar? They are, it's a stable coin basically tied 1-to-1 with silver in a vault and audited. What do you think of that idea? Is that a legit way to do a stable coin, or what are your thoughts on stable coins tied to precious metals?
It can be gamed. Mm-hmm. It can be gamed. And that's why we have to get away from the idea of having anything backed by anything, because it can be gamed. So, I mean, that's my research is shown that when our debt was backed by gold, and gold was gamed. And how do they do that? By creating depressions. In 1907, they just stopped lending. It created a problem. In the 70s, it was silver. They tried to corner it. It created a problem. And then you start losing the belief that that's the system that works. And then look where we're at. We're back in this 45. Well, it's not that we're back in this 45-degree Fahrenheit pool. We're still in it. The vision of EOS and what it's creating it's the one that really needs to be fostered. What do I mean by that? Is a token with limited supply. Yes, I understand we have inflation, but the block producers do need. I mean, someone's got to get paid for maintaining the resources and so on and so forth. So I'm okay with the 1%. I think 5% was too high, but the 1% is reasonable. But then, it allows us to create value with that token, using the resources, getting that REX. And as more people adopt the system, then more EOS need to be saved or staked to be able to interact with all the DApps that hopefully will be emerging. I think we're also, as a community, placing a little bit too much stress on Block One to do everything, and so we're starting to hear different ideas about new projects, and we're working on one, and so I'm going to plug that right now.
Yeah, what are you guys working on?
Okay, the lead way is that how can a regular person create a product or service and be able to charge without the need for anyone else? And so so let me share it, and I think there's already audio, so let me explain it before we go into it. But like it or not, most of the applications, decentralized applications that exist on EOS are gambling apps. So we took this EOS Royale roulette game, and we wrote a script to start auditing the numbers to create a statistical advantage. But that really wasn't what interested me. What interested me is, okay, now we have something of value, and we want to sell it. But we want to be able to create a point of sale system that doesn't take PayPal into consideration, Visa, MasterCard, nothing. Federal Reserve dollars, United States notes, whatever it is. Well, I would have taken United States notes. But anyway, it's you're self-relying with your application and how you're going to charge for that product. So without further ado, let me share this little video. It works. We created this account for people that didn't have accounts, and now you end up with a resume of all the numbers that are audited. But this isn't really what interested me. It's the ability to purchase this data using EOS. So at this point, we're going to click to begin, and we're able to charge 1 EOS for the data, and that data will remain on your browser as long as you don't close your window. And so within seconds, now the point of sale system will come up, you agree, and then you start having the data of the rollouts. So why this is interesting, it's a leeway to what we're working on. We're working on what I like to call, it's not what I like to call, it's what it is called. It's the EOS Marketplace. So just imagine that you're able to sell your product or your service by a click of a button. Also imagine that we all have value and we're using GPS to broadcast what the products and services of the other person. So to give you an example, how often are we in a subway or a bus or an airplane? Well, everyone around us has some value, but we just don't know it. We can't, if we start shaking hands and passing out business cards, it's not reasonable. But imagine being a web browser where the code is being deployed. Well, it's probably hybrid, and those that choose to broadcast themselves are able to broadcast themselves wherever they go. So row 23, seat A could be an accountant, and he could be, hey, I'm an accountant. These are my specialties. This is what I specialize in, and this is what my cost is in EOS. And right there and then, you can close a sale. And what's awesome about EOS and blockchain is that Mr. Accountant has a history, right? On eBay, we like to buy from people that are 100% or close to 100%. Well, shoot, Mr. Accountant can only broadcast the services through an EOS identity, and that EOS identity will have a history of if he's good or not. So we call it EOS Marketplace. It's not that I need another business, but I found that if we don't start pickling and shoveling, then someone else is waiting for the other person to do it. And so I think it has a lot of power. And how do we monetize it? I think we're between 0.5% of the gross sale. Well, we started at 0.2, but then we said, well, let's use the 0.2 to go to some foundations. EOS Venezuela, Empower Me EOS, organizations that are dedicating themselves to help others.
What's Empower Me EOS? I haven't heard of that.
Zane, a couple of guys that we met at the EOS Everything festivity on May 31st, I wanted to thank them for what they were doing, and instead of them receiving EOS, they said, we'll send it to Empower Me EOS. So I don't know, I don't remember too much about their organization, but it's one of those where they're, just kind of like their EOS address is saying, it's empowering people. And in the end, that's what we're about. And how our liquidity is being created, we're limiting the X factor of how we can empower others. If we're enslaved to paying interest to pay for a debt that we don't need to have.
What do you kind of see the optimal future, let's say 20 years down the road, as far as like an operating government and a monetary system? What's that look like, do you think, if things were done correctly and crypto was involved?
Oh man, that's a question for a Friday night with a cold beer in my hand. That's what you dream about. So I can give you something that I've felt, right? And what this, the voice can be a part of, what EOS Marketplace could be a part of, what browsing could be a part of, if they start sharing some of the profit, what banking can be a part of with no fractional reserve lending. I mean, you should lend what you have in reserve and nothing more, but you should have an ability to collect a little bit of interest based on what you lend. But then if you're able to further share some of that profit from your interest with others. This is what I would love to see. We all have different strengths. Not all of us can be brain surgeons, because then who cooks? Then who builds the roads? But passion for what we do is really important. So there's people that, love cleaning the bay, love cleaning, taking care of animals. Well, that's going to change when people really get to do what they love and not worry too much about the financial constraint of what they have to do day in and day out. Most of us get up in the morning and think about, I got to go to work because I got to pay my debt. But imagine the difference if I said, I got to go to work because I got to get this EOS Marketplace out. It's impossible. So, and the interesting part is that at that end of those 20 years where people are getting up and getting to do what they love to do, because we're all a part of this, universal basic income that is sustaining some of their basic needs. There's going to be other pressures. Who knows? But all I know is that when a 45-degree pool of water and EOS is at 75, and man, we should all be saying how nice this feels to be in this pool.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a fantastic talk, and I'll give you a chance to share any kind of final thoughts or last topics you'd like to. On my end, the EOS podcast, this is by EOS Writer, and EOS Writer is quickly becoming one of the main media sources in EOS. So if people who haven't heard of it, it is where you can get up to date, quick, and really legit info on EOS, and it's been endorsed by Brendan Bloomer himself. So EOS Writer has been taken off lately. Another shout out to Hybrid.Games, Scott over there. Sends chat if anyone wants free wallets. And Mr. Happy Money Proxy, I've got a proxy that I vote for the very best block producers that are transparent, empowering, and building together. That's my motto. So if you are looking for someone who has met most of the block producers and done a lot of research on that, Mr. Happy Money Proxy is a good proxy. That's what I've been doing. So Maurice, what are your final thoughts, topics, anything to say, any asks to the audience you'd like to talk about as we start to wind down the show here?
Yeah, so I wanted the focus to be on monetary policy. I mean, I love EOS and blockchain, but I think there's got to be a time spent on why this technology has emerged. And to that end, I want to share a picture and a little story about Jekyll Island. So what ended up happening in Jekyll Island, it was an island off the coast of Georgia, and that's where the monopolists of the Gilded Age would go escape the harsh winters of the Northeast. Back in the late 1800s, you caught a cold, it turned into pneumonia, and you were dead. Just ask Harrison, right? So they would go down there, and I want to now share this picture before I say anything else.
Yeah, go.
Give an idea where we're at. And so this is a black tie dinner, and the monopolists of the Gilded Age would meet, not every night, but certainly they would have black tie dinners at Jekyll Island. The Morgans, Pulitzer, Carnegie, you had Rockefeller, you had the Vanderbilts, and so these were monopolists. So what do you think they were going to come up with? Well, they came up with another monopoly, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And I think we need to be aware of that. And I want to share one more slide. The effect that it had. And the effect that it had is that we had an incredible candidate in William Jennings Bryan. I don't know if you've ever heard of him because he didn't win. But there was he gave an incredible speech, and he traveled the entire nation. And this is a quote by William Jennings Bryan. Please do the honors and read this quote to our audience.
The bankers tell us that the issue of money is a function of the bank and that the government ought to go out of the banking business. I stand with Jefferson rather than with them and say that the issue of money is a function of government and that the banks should go out of the governing business. William Jennings Bryan.
Yes. So he lost because the monopolists of the Gilded Age put incredible amount of money on his competition. We would have been lucky to have had him, but we didn't. So anyway, we are, I think that's it. The crypto community needs to kind of take a few steps back and think about why we're here and be more optimistic of where we're going, not why we're here. And there is a saying in Spanish, we're talking about Libra, and maybe it's backed by fiat, which makes it an irony. But I'm going to say it in Spanish. You ready for our Spanish audience? No hay mal que por bien no venga. So what that translates to is that maybe Libra isn't going to help the cause. I mean, the real cause of empowering people, of giving people the ability to be more valuable over time. But something good will come out of it. And I think it's already been covered, right? It could be an on-ramp for people to start now feeling comfortable about crypto. So that's how I like to end it. I appreciate you having me here. I appreciate you letting me plug EOS Marketplace. I appreciate you letting me plug EOS Venezuela. And I hope to be back in your show one of these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll leave EOS Marketplace, the links for that, and Venezuela, and the Jekyll Island, the truth behind the Federal Reserve. We'll leave links for that stuff in there. And then if anyone's just hearing this part, there was a question in the heart of the interview for a silver coin that Maurice is generously donating and giving out to one of you lucky listeners. So whoever heard that, you can take the steps to win that coin. This was killer, Maurice. Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right. That's the end of the EOS podcast for today, my EOS podcast friends. This is the EOS podcast by EOS Writer. Cheers.
The money is not the prime asset in life. Time is.